All right, it looks like folks are getting assembled, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to discuss fiduciary education. This is a topic we spend a lot of time at Marquette discussing with our clients, and we're excited to spend some time talking about it with you today. By way of introduction, my name is Stephanie Osten. I'm a principal at Marquette Associates. Been in the industry about 16 years with a focus on not-for-profit clients, really digging into those fiduciary education topics. Myself, as well as my colleagues, Mike Piotrowski and Linsey Payne, lead up Marquette's not-for-profit services group. And with that, I'll give them a moment to introduce themselves.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Piotrowski. I'm a partner and general consultant. And while I work primarily with nonprofit clients today, over the 20 years I've been at Marquette, I've worked across a wide variety of clients. So we appreciate your time today.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Linsey Payne. I'm also a partner at Marquette. I've been here for almost 10 years, primarily working with nonprofits and also a recovering attorney. So this topic is really exciting to me. With that, we will kick things off. We'll start with an overview of today's objectives. First, we're going to dig into what it means to be a fiduciary, who qualifies, what do those responsibilities look like in practice. Then, since many of you are here today to better understand your fiduciary concepts as they pertain to your role on perhaps an investment committee or a finance committee, we'll discuss those key duties and functions in that capacity. Lastly, we'll highlight some best practices around things like spending policy and reporting to really help you in fulfilling those fiduciary duties. With that, let's jump into the role of the fiduciary. In the investment space, a fiduciary is generally someone who assumes control or responsibility for management of assets that are being held for the benefit of an organization or one or more third parties. The entrustment piece is really key here, and these duties are generally delegated either through a contract or specific bylaws, but there are also inherent fiduciary duties that are associated with common law simply based on the nature of the relationship. In general, the more control that is delegated, the greater that fiduciary responsibility becomes. And the two primary duties are the duty of loyalty and the duty of prudence. And we'll dive into both of those. So there are a number of different fiduciary principles, but again, most of them can generally fall into these two categories, loyalty and prudence. So we'll start with loyalty. The duty of loyalty is also known as the exclusive purpose rule. So fiduciaries must act solely in the interest of the fund or the investment pool and really prioritize those interests above the fiduciary's own interest. There's also an element of fairness here and impartiality. So fiduciaries really need to strike that right balance, particularly if there can be conflicting interest among the various stakeholders. And then comes the duty of prudence. This is also known as the prudent person rule, where fiduciaries must act with the care, skill, prudence, and diligence under the circumstances that someone with familiarity with those issues would act. And this could mean hiring an expert or a service provider that can provide additional resources that then complements maybe the expertise level of the underlying fiduciaries. And this is one of the main reasons Marquette exists as a business. We can step into that role as that investment expert. Courts have emphasized with this duty of prudence just the importance of procedural prudence. And so they recognize that decisions and hindsight can really be 20/20. And so when you're considering and when fiduciaries are considering decision making after the fact, it's not necessarily the outcome that is important or that is the focus, but rather the process and the procedures that the fiduciaries took to ultimately make that decision. That process part is really the key, and we'll talk about some ways to achieve that. But first, who is a fiduciary? We touched on this a little earlier, but the key element here is control. So trustees and committee members and even certain staff that can move assets or impact the portfolio and where things are invested, these are all persons that are considered fiduciaries. And this is typically, again, outlined in the bylaws or some other incorporating documentation. There are also contracted fiduciaries, such as investment consultants like Marquette, or your investment funds and the investment managers that you're utilizing. Custodians and attorneys would also fall into this category. But just because the services have a contract associated with them doesn't mean that those vendors are acting as fiduciaries. And I think that that is an important thing to note. So accountants, auditors, actuaries, they all may work with the nonprofit, but because they don't actually have decision-making control over the investments, their advice may not always be considered fiduciarily backed. So something to keep in mind. And then stakeholders of the organization, think donors or students, if it's a higher education. These individuals may have very strong opinions about how the investments should be managed, but that doesn't mean that they are fiduciaries. With great power comes great responsibility. So it's important to recognize the liability and risk associated with being a fiduciary. In addition to personal liability, co-fiduciary liability can exist where responsibilities have been delegated. So for an example, an investment consultant where that relationship is now discretionarily managed. So the investment consultant has the ability to direct investments and select investment managers. That liability is then shifted to that investment consultant, but it doesn't entirely move the fiduciary liability for the committee or the trustees or the board. There's co-fiduciary liability there where there's still a duty to monitor those vendors where liability is assumed. And then obviously criminal liability is also a component to this. And given the importance of these duties and the potential for liability, many fiduciaries will seek insurance, and a lot of committees are structured accordingly to really help protect their underlying trustees from these types of incidences, especially where the positions themselves are voluntary. I had mentioned this earlier, but fiduciary duties in practice really comes down to process. And while I don't want to steal Mike's thunder, I know he's going to talk about best practices later on. There are a few things that I wanted to mention just to assist you all in sort of fine-tuning your practices. First and foremost is the investment policy statement. This is really the roadmap. It sets the stage for everyone involved, making sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of what processes to actually follow. Preparing for the meetings is important. Going back to that prudent person standard, you might not always make the best decision, but as long as you do the work, you will make an informed one. And that's really where the fiduciary duty comes into play. Using peer group analysis is also important. It's not necessarily something you need to mirror. You don't necessarily need to look like other foundations or endowments, but it is a good barometer just to have a sense of what others in the space are doing, particularly other pools of assets of similar size. And then another important thing to note is just to not take your vendors at face value. At the end of the day, that fiduciary liability to monitor your vendors is always there. So ask questions, make sure you understand, and so that you can approach the process with all the information. The Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, it's a handful, MIFA for short. This also provides a list of standards for managing and investing, or I'm sorry, managing institutional funds. And these are items that fiduciaries should consider when they are making investment decisions. There's obviously exceptions. So if it's a donor advised fund and there's specific parameters in place, the fiduciaries should follow those. But these standards include, looking at or getting an assessment of the general economic conditions. So what's going on in the market? What are the longer term capital market assumptions that you're basing your strategy on? How does inflation or deflation impact this? What are the tax consequences, which could play a larger role given some of the proposed changes currently in the White House pertaining to the tax code? And what are the needs of the organization from a cash flow perspective? The goal is to really capture all of these things in the investment policy statement and then monitor on an ongoing basis through quarterly meetings, the quarterly reports, and then ad hoc projects like stress testing the portfolio. Again, procedural prudence is really the key here, and we'll go through some examples of what that looks like in actual practice. In summary, fiduciaries have specific duties and responsibilities where procedure and process is more important than the outcome. So to apply these duties in practice, we really look to the typical board and committee responsibilities, which include things like setting that investment policy statement, regularly reviewing that to make sure that the committee is complying with what they've agreed to, regularly looking at the spending policy and making sure that the asset allocation is structured appropriately, stress testing the portfolio to ensure that that asset allocation is also set appropriately, but more importantly, making sure that the committee is comfortable with where markets could take the portfolio in the event of a downturn. Making sure that the committee has the appropriate membership, so folks that are committed to spending the time preparing ahead of the meeting and attending the meeting, and also providing unique perspectives that can help the overall investment. And reviewing and monitoring the service providers on a regular basis, especially where those fiduciary duties have been delegated. Remember, you still have that fiduciary duty to monitor. And then last but not least, looking at costs, knowing really what the portfolio program is costing. You don't need to necessarily be using the lowest cost service providers across the board. Courts have made that pretty clear, but they have noted that fiduciaries need to understand what is actually being paid to run the investment program. So that is also key. With that, I will turn things over to Stephanie to dive a bit deeper into the investment committee.
Thank you, Linsey. Let's dive into the responsibilities of the investment committee, or for some of you, what might be known as the finance committee. This committee is responsible for the oversight and guidance of the investment portfolio. We find that a high-quality investment program has the following defining characteristics. First, the governance structure should be clear and lay a solid foundation for oversight. Responsibilities should be fully assigned, tying back to Linsey's comments on process. Often we see committees use a committee charter to really outline this process and structure and document that delegation. Importantly, the asset allocation for each portfolio should be aligned with the return objectives and risk tolerance of the organization. The target asset allocation should then be assessed at a regular cadence for appropriateness. The investment policy statement should then clearly articulate the return objective and risk tolerance of the organization, as well as other parameters, which we'll go into. And then on an ongoing basis, often quarterly for many committees, the committee should meet and review the portfolio against those objectives and targets, really to ensure that the portfolio is performing as expected. That's a lot of work, and it's best carried out by a strong investment committee. And while we recognize that every committee looks different, here we share some common characteristics we've observed across strong, effective investment committees. First, those committees are often diverse in membership, bringing different skill sets to the table, whether or not that's a deep familiarity of the organization's mission or a strong investment knowledge. Committees should be conscious of their size and consider term lengths for members. And importantly, members need to be engaged in meetings, attending and participating. These meetings should be consistent and agendas should be laid out clearly ahead of time, really allowing time for preparation and allowing members to form opinions around important topics and decision items. We find strong investment committees thrive off of dialogue and an exchange of ideas. In order to achieve this, meetings should have a welcoming atmosphere where all members can contribute to the conversation. And lastly, strong investment committees hold themselves accountable. This is often accomplished through an annual committee self-assessment, evaluating the committee's performance against their goals, and identifying areas where things are going well as areas for improvement. In contrast, toxic investment committees have very different characteristics, often struggling with problematic committee dynamics or organizational issues. A toxic committee might have one or two members who dominate the conversation, disrupting that welcoming atmosphere, or members who deal with conflicts of interest that are not recognized. Organizational issues, whether they're lack of structure or infrequent attendance of meetings or organization issues going on at the organization, can both contribute to a toxic investment committee. We encourage committees to examine their committee dynamics and proactively address these problems as they arise. The work of the investment committee generally starts with portfolio construction, establishing the target asset allocation for the portfolio. We consider a few key variables specific to each organization and the portfolio's purpose. Taking a look at them on the left, time horizon, return target, cash flow profile, and so on. We then look to build a portfolio that's expected to meet the organization's goals using a universe of investable asset classes. Each asset class has a different set of risk and return characteristics and serves a different role in the portfolio. The chart on the right shows, very simply, the trade-off in risk return for each asset class. Generally speaking, asset classes with a higher expected rate of return come with more expected risk. An optimal portfolio is one that combines various asset classes to reduce overall portfolio risk. Many of your organizations portfolios are governed by a spending policy that is a regular amount that is distributed from the portfolio on an ongoing basis. And we find that this truly drives the asset allocation. MIFA outlines 7 spending policy factors, a few of which Linsey hit on in relation to the spending policy. First, the duration and preservation of the endowment fund. Most endowments are designed to be perpetual, so the preservation of purchasing power, often measured by inflation, should be considered, while others might have sunset provisions or just be designed to exist for a while, like 20 years. The purposes of the institution or the fund that really relates to spending the monies of the fund in line with donor intent, general economic conditions and the impacts of inflation or deflation, so really the investment environment in which you are constructing your portfolio, the expected return of those investments, which generally should be aligned with spending, as well as any other resources of the institution. Looking very simply at this organization's return objective over here on the left, you can see an organization with a 4% spending rate looking to outgrow inflation and cover their expenses might have a return target around 7%. One way that committees can address some of the MIFA spending policy considerations is by thinking closely about their spending policy calculation methodology. There are a few here that we define that have smoothing effects over time within the portfolio. The simple spending rule, which is a raw percentage of the portfolio, we see that as the least common, is simple, but fails to account for those economic impacts when the market may not support the spending rate of the organization. We find a moving average spending rule, an inflation-based method, or some combination of the two tends to help organizations smooth out their spending rate over time. Once responsibilities have been outlined and the asset allocation of the portfolio is defined, all of that rolls up into the investment policy statement, which you've likely heard referred to as the roadmap of the investment program. And the reason you hear us use that term so commonly is because it's true. It includes all of the elements that the organization needs to know, as well as the consultant and investment managers, to implement the investment program, starting with the scope and purpose, where responsibilities are outlined for each party, Governance, really outlining who's responsible for what, including the update and review of the investment policy. That investment objective, as well as risk return requirements, including the spending policy, should be clearly outlined, as well as any specifics regarding risk tolerance. Lastly, risk management, that is really outlining the appropriate metrics for evaluation of the performance, as well as a policy for rebalancing, and any restrictions on assets should be clearly outlined. On an ongoing basis, reporting should be transparent and understandable. We understand that most committee members are volunteers, and as such, the reporting should be very easy for you to digest and form an opinion on prior to the meeting. As a best practice, reporting should be done against whatever allocations are outlined in the investment policy statement, as well as appropriate benchmarks. We like to see trailing, annualized, as well as calendar year performance. Linsey mentioned peer performance comparisons. We find those can be particularly helpful to evaluate investment managers compared to a peer group, as well as helpful and instructive at the total fund level. Benchmarks should be broad-based and investable, and we should also include fee analysis as well as comparisons against others. To that point on transparency, this will be a very familiar page to any of you who've seen a Marquette investment report. Fees should be reported in a very transparent way. You can see here outlining the fee schedule, comparing it to an industry median, and the objective here really to include all of the fees so the committee understands where the organization's dollars are being spent to carry out this program. Lastly, Linsey hit on peer analysis, and we find this can be very helpful to understand how your portfolio is aligned relative to peers and explain those performance drivers. I specifically, surveys such as NACUBO and other trend surveys can provide really helpful data in what your peers might be looking at regarding alternative investments and new potential asset classes, as well as some guidance on what your peers are doing in terms of spending rates. And while we do understand organizations' missions are different, we find many of those organizations out there are evaluating the same economic conditions and the same considerations you are, and find that information can be very useful when evaluating the portfolio. With that, I'll hand it over to Mike to hit on a few best practices when carrying out the investment program.
Thanks, Stephanie. And now that we have learned about the fiduciary principles, as well as the role that an investment committee plays, let's discuss some of the fiduciary best practices. Pre-meeting planning and post-meeting documentation obviously play an important role when discussing fiduciary best practices. We believe that an efficient meeting should have a set agenda outlining both the topics to be covered as well as the items for action. The agenda should be specific, including details on date, time, location, the format, either in person or virtual, as well as a list of participants. Meeting materials should be sent in advance, ideally 1 week, if not more, to allow for ample time to review. And then after the meeting, effective minutes should be drafted. They should be sent to the committee for review, and the documents that were reviewed at the committee meeting should be retained. Ultimately, developing a consistent and repeatable process for both pre-meeting planning and post-meeting documentation will ensure committee success. As we go to the next slide, it's common for nonprofit organizations to have regular and frequent changes to their investment committee, finance committee, and/or boards of directors. This is a common occurrence, and as new committee members join, it's important to prepare them to be an effective member by providing an orientation or an education session to get up to speed. Common education topics include a history of the organization, its policies, and its investment portfolio. Often this education is led by staff or a committee chair. However, the investment advisor can also play a leading role in this new committee member onboarding. And providing this historical perspective, setting clear expectations, ultimately leads to, in our opinion, a more engaged committee member and a more highly functioning investment committee as a whole. So we're very big proponents of making sure that committee members, as they come on board, are well integrated into the committee structure and have that historical perspective. Related, investment committees have a lot of work to tackle on an annual basis. We are big proponents of, and we encourage our clients to develop an annual governance plan or an annual work plan to use as both a way to effectively communicate with committee members, as well as a way to stay really organized throughout the year. Most of the items that an investment committee will review occur either on a regular or an infrequent basis. You know, the items that are reviewed regularly, you know, they include a variety of topics, but, you know, a review of the investment portfolio positioning and performance, liquidity needs, and expenses, and oftentimes just a general market environment overview. And items that are covered less frequently, often on an annual basis, those include, you know, a review of the investment policy statement, perhaps the spending policy or the asset allocation policy. So clearly delineating and having a plan for these items, we think is super important. Having this clear work plan defines what items will be covered at each meeting so that everyone is aligned. And we believe this to be a best practice in leading to ultimately a very organized investment committee. And as we've discussed today, good governance practices lead to highly functioning committees. Having clearly defined processes that include strong procedures, being well prepared, and documenting actions are all fiduciary musts in our book. At the end of the day, the fiduciary responsibility revolves around process. As Linsey mentioned earlier, you know, a committee or an individual committee member will not necessarily be judged by the outcome of the actions that they take, but rather on the process to reach those decisions. So process is something that we always preach. And as we wrap up today, you know, let's remember that the fiduciary role comes with important responsibilities, that this process is key to fulfilling those responsibilities, and that ultimately Marquette, as your advisor, can help with that oversight. So with that, we're very appreciative of your time today. Thank you very much. We hope that you found this information both informative as well as beneficial to your organization. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the day today.